Okay, so I've been wanting to do a video on this topic since basically the birth of this channel, but I've never really had the proper vehicle to do so. That is, until this happened.
Russia's Federal Customs Service says an American was detained after their officers allegedly found vape cartridges containing hashish oil in her luggage at an airport near Moscow in February. A local news outlet identified that person as WNBA star Brittany Griner.
Now, I did do a whole video on the Britney situation a while back, but I never really got around to really unpacking the subtext around it. And a big reason that is because, frankly, not enough people cared, as evidenced by that video's view count. And this, folks, is why I've been wanting to ask this very pertinent question that's been running roughshod over my mind since I was basically able to distinguish a penis from a pussycat. That being, do black women really matter? And no, I don't mean in the hashtag BLM all women matter sort of way, but do black women specifically matter? I mean, this guy might say no, but then again, he's not really saying much of anything these days, now is he? Okay, that was pretty low, even by my standards, I will admit. Nope, not gonna do it, Clarence. Back in 2017, in a series of tweets, actress Rose McGowan accused movie exec Harvey Nochins of initiating a not-so-consensual game of private part ping pong with her. Further, she accused Amazon studio exec Roy Price, who himself has been accused of unsolicited sausage slinging, of ignoring her initial complaints regarding Weinstein's assault upon her. In the following days, Twitter was lit alight with the kind of outrage that only a young, attractive white celebrity could ignite. The most notable of which was a tweet sent out by Alyssa Milano encouraging fellow victims of sexual abuse to reply, respond, and retweet their own stories accompanied by the hashtag #MeToo, because nothing says solidarity like a social media challenge. In the days following that, both social and traditional media alike were quick to heap praise upon Milano for kickstarting what many scholars would now call the fourth wave feminist movement, by coining the rallying cry around which women the world over could, well, rally. Except Milano didn't coin the term, not by a long shot even. And McGowan wasn't the first person to call Harvey need some shaving cream down on the carpet for abusing his penis-powered privilege. Allegations against Weinstein in both the States and the UK date back to at least the 80s, including accusations made in 2015 by Italian model Ambra Gutierrez. Now, after her initial complaint, Gutierrez cooperated with police in obtaining an audio recording of Weinstein asking her to watch him shower.
I'm telling you right now.
What do we have to do here?
Nothing. I'm going to take a shower. You sit there and have a drink. Water.
I don't drink. Can I stay on the bar?
No, you must come here now.
No.
1 minute.
No,
I ask
I can't.
you. Go to the bathroom.
Please, I don't want to do something I don't want
Go to the bathroom. Come here. Listen to me.
I want to go downstairs.
I'm not going to do anything. You'll never see me again after this. Okay? That's it.
Think about that for a second. This guy asked this girl to watch him disrobe and bathe himself like he was doing her a favor. And this, fellas, is why I say confidence is half the battle. Yet the Manhattan DA decided not to pursue charges against Weinstein. Why? Well, because of a Hollywood-sponsored smear campaign against Gutierrez, painting her out as an opportunist looking to blackmail her way up the social pyramid. And I mean, even if that were true, which it wasn't, again, she had to sit there and watch this guy get naked. That's got to be worth at least a couple racks, right? Now, I'm going to be straight with y'all. When I first saw the name Gutierrez, I immediately assumed that this was a Latina. And I bet you did too. And if you and I both did, what makes you think the media didn't also? I mean, like, for real, y'all, look at this girl. She's practically one PR Pride parade away from fitting a 2005 Honda Civic with like 10 different Boricua bumper stickers and a low suspension kit. My point is, in 2017, Weinstein and Hollywood casting couch culture in general ran into a perfect poop storm of factors that resulted in their long overdue reckoning, not the least of which being a victim equal parts white and famous willing to light the fire. And another equal parts white and slightly less famous, at least by 2017 standards, woman to keep it burning by coining the catchphrase that would define a movement. Except, like I said earlier, Milano didn't do that. Who did do that was Tarana Burke. And that was 10 years prior to the McGowan saga, in fact. Burke, a Bronx native, was black, obviously, and impoverished as a child. Two factors that make it hard for American media to accept her victimhood. Because you see, the cold, hard, and ugly truth about black women in America is rarely do their stories matter to the mainstream, except when those stories can either A, be used by the mainstream to advance its own interests, or 2, when they can be weaponized against those who threaten said interests. The hypersexualization and accompanying objectification of black people, women specifically, is a tale as old as, well, racism, frankly. Venus of Hottentot, Coal Black, movies like Coffee and Foxy Brown. Hell, last year's Grammys are all examples of Western, and in this case, America's obsession with objectifying black and, for that matter, Latina and indigenous women's bodies. And listen, this isn't meant as any shade to Meg, Cardi, or even Nicki and Kim for the grown folks in the room, but let's keep it a buck. These women are household names just as much for booty as they are for bars. And for the record, I ain't mad at it. But let's go back, way back to the 17th century when men were men, but still managed to look like women. And all women were witches. And instead of Cuban link chains, oversized toilet paper rolls were the height of high fashion. If there's one thing that has always sold better than designer drugs, it's sex. Even in a time in which the topic was more taboo than talking about Bruno. And this song still slaps, by the way. And European writers, quick to exploit the prejudice and lust of their audiences, turned to the dark continent, sensationalizing the things that they saw in their travels to the point of it basically just being an old English language hustler. And verily I did thrust mine member betwixt her most bountiful bosom, again and again and again, until it felt as though mine very soul was snatched from mine mortal coil and burst forth with the strength of a mighty rushing torrent. Such exhaustion, and yet such sweet, sweet elation. Writings by 17th century media writers like Jean Barbeau, for example, described African dances, men and women knocking bellies together indecently while uttering some mysterious dirty words. And naval officer Abraham Duquesne described black women as desiring the caress of a white man. And I mean, he's not completely wrong in that regard. Black women in the Americas were always just as desirable for their work in the field as their work in the bedchamber. This is evidenced by an entire race-based caste system being created in places like Brazil, Haiti, Cuba, and pretty much anywhere else in the Caribbean and South America, where anywhere between 60 and 80% of the 10.7 million Africans who actually survived the Middle Passage ultimately wound up. These mixed-race Negroes became known as mulattoes, which is why this girl had to change her rap name once she realized she had read The Room, or a history book for that matter. According to historian John Simpkin, female slaves were expected to begin having children by age 13, and by 20, they were expected to have had at least 4 or 5. Some slave masters even promised freedom to women who could manage to bear 15 or more children. The more desirable slaves were set aside for the master's use, even if and when that woman was already married. The bastard would then obviously use the woman for both his own pleasure and as a living incubator, because, can't let something silly like cholera or whooping cough or, just basic human decency deplete the workforce after all. In 1861, Harriet Ann Jacobs published her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, in which she detailed the trauma she endured living in the same house as her abuser. Before falling in love with a black man and being forbidden by her abuser from marrying him, She was only able to escape his house when she began a relationship with another white man who she would have 2 children with, believing that doing so would offer her some form of protection at least. But because this is 19th century America, the abuse continued. And when her master found out about the new relationship, he became violent, even threatening to sell her children off if she continued to rebuff the advances of his micro member. So Jacobs did the only thing that she really had any power to do, and that was plot her escape, knowing that as a fugitive, her children would be raised by her grandmother, whose attic she hid in for 7 years, watching her children grow up through a crack in the wall until she was finally able to escape to Philadelphia in 1842. And despite the wife of her new employer's attempts, Jacobs was never able to secure the freedom of her 2 children and would not reunite with them until after the war. In 1850, a 14-year-old black girl named Celia was purchased by Robert Newsom. Almost immediately upon arriving on the farm, she was raped by Newsom, who continued to do so on a nightly basis for the next 5 years. After becoming pregnant for a second time as a result of the abuse, Celia, at the behest of her black lover George, purposed to end all her abuse once and for all. In June of 1855, when Newsom came into Celia's room for his nightly rendezvous, Celia rebuffed him, retreating to a corner in the cabin. When Newsom continued his approach, Celia grabbed a wooden stick in the corner and struck Newsom in the head with it. When Newsom fell after the first strike, she got up and she struck him again, this time killing him. Because Celia was a slave and therefore property, though the state of Missouri where this saga took place criminalized rape, Celia was offered no such protection and thus was convicted and hanged for first-degree murder. The point I'm getting at here is that black and, for that matter, Latina, Asian, and indigenous women are not viewed by mass society in the same light and thus not afforded the same kind of protection as white women, except in very specific circumstances that I'll talk about later. Ethnic women are often hypersexualized based on little more than their ethnicity alone. The spicy Latina, the lustful savage, the Asian dragon lady, and of course, Jezebel are all tropes in popular culture and media that reduce women to sex objects based on nothing but their skin color and or country of origin. And I mean, bet. Personal preference speaking here, but I've always kind of had a thing for dark skin, even though my mom is as yellow as a Post-it note, but my favorite aunties growing up were so because they were dark skinned. My first girlfriend was dark skinned. My wife is only like a shade darker than me, but when we started talking, she had just come back from the Caribbean, so she was darker than a Slayer album at that point. Point being, I admittedly have a dark skin fetish, something that's not nearly as flattering as some of y'all might think. As someone who has experienced fetishization myself, which I've talked about in a past video, I can empathize with girls and women who get chocolate princess and Coco Queen comments more often than Ben Simmons misses a game. You see, the problem with fetishization is that it's just objectification by another name. You reduce a person to a single aspect of themselves that you find attractive, thus you don't love or even like the person so much as you love your own fantasy. And the fact that someone, whether willfully or not, can fulfill that fantasy, well, that just makes you more jazzed than Nick Cannon on Father's Day. What I'm saying is minority women, particularly the black ones, have been and continue to be fetishized based on both their otherness and white supremacist ideas of black sexuality. In the same way white girls are often fetishized by many black men, black women are fetishized by both white men and women. However, whereas many black men who fetishize white women do so based on their perceived virtue and therefore the apparent status that comes with being with a white girl or whatever, black women are fetishized based on their perceived lack of virtue. Okay, I'm not going to go through the whole history of the Jezebel trope, but come on, y'all. You know it when you see it. Like I said before, it's cold black. It's pretty much every role Pam Grier played during the 70s. It's Patrice in Coming to America and Listerine and Booty Call. It's literally every mid-aughts video vixen from Melissa Ford to Buffy the Body. Like, the trope is so common that one of Drawn Together's most popular characters was literally just a parody of it. Or at least I hope it was a parody. Otherwise, this is very problematic. I mean, up until like the third episode of Lovecraft Country, it was pretty strongly implied that Letty was a Jezebel. And that's probably why the subversion in that episode worked so well. Because again, that's how we've become accustomed to seeing attractive black women depicted in media. Now, while I'm on this mini rant, let me give you an example of what I'll call an anti-Jezebel. Now, I'm not going to cap with y'all. I did give a little side eye to the showrunner saving the whole reformed junkie arc for the black girl, but maybe it's in the book or something. I wouldn't know. I'm a YouTuber. We don't read anything longer than 240 characters. And also the fact that she did eventually wind up sleeping with a married man, which kind of kills my whole case, but just shut up and follow me for a second. Now, that being said, what I did like was Marianne's initially cold as ice reception to this weirdo white guy's advances, especially when juxtaposed against Beck's borderline reckless naivete and Love's just straight up batshit insanity. You know why? Because that's real. And as many reverse racism claims I'm bound to get for saying this, in my experience at least, I've always had a harder time pitching woo to black or pretty much anything browner than beige women than white girls. And that's because black women, generally speaking, of course, are excluded from assuming that if things do go sideways, that they'll be protected, if not by an individual, then at least by the system. Something that Marianne makes abundantly clear to both the audience and Joe or Will or Algernon or whatever he's calling himself these days. Which is precisely why them ending her arc the way they did was so freaking brain dead. Like, y'all really just pretty much turned this girl into brown-skinned Beck. And for what? So California Creeper could get a nut off? All that being said, once I did start writing this script, a bunch of examples of the Jezebel stereotype started flooding my mind. And a lot of y'all are going to get mad at me for saying this, but chief among them are Meg and Cardi. Okay, admittedly, neither one of them is really my cup of coffee, but I'm not reducing their artistry down to little more than bust lines and butt cheeks. What I am saying is that they found a formula that works. One pioneered by people like Lil' Kim and Trina in the 90s and early aughts, and then refined by Nicki in the 2010s, and then quite obviously perfected by them today. That formula being providing the masses with an endless stream of fat fodder to accompany their bars. And it works, because again, this is what America and, dare I say, Western society thinks of black women. And before y'all bring up Marilyn Monroe and Madonna and any other buxom Becky as a rebuff, ask yourself this. Would the world have been as shocked and appalled by their antics if they weren't white? Like, don't get it twisted now. Marilyn, Madonna, even Britney and Katie at their peaks were all considered deviant to the norm, despite how comparably modest the latter two were compared to many of their black contemporaries. And I'd argue that was a big part of their appeal. Why? Because white girls, the good ones at least, aren't supposed to behave like that. At least that's what society says. Black women, on the other hand, I mean, for pretty much the duration of my child and early adulthood, arguably most popular black female pop acts, with a few notable exceptions, of course, all based at least their image, if not artistry, on their sexuality. Janet Jackson is the first and maybe best example of what I'm talking about. I mean, obviously, I wasn't around yet during the 80s, but throughout the 90s, Janet's image and music became increasingly more sexualized. And in the process, she managed to stake unequivocal claim to the second most famous Jackson crown and a spot alongside her brother as a cultural icon. I mean, that is until that whole nip slip fiasco. Many a manhood were awakened that fateful night. Mariah Carey is another example of a black female artist who gradually shifted the focus of her artistry from her 5-octave vocals to her voluptuous figure. Albeit man-made, but I mean, again, cheeks is cheeks. Or In this case, boobs is boobs. Girl groups of the 90s and early aughts like En Vogue, SWV, and TLC in particular made it a point to avoid having their image be reduced to eye candy. But toward the end of that decade, TLC at least had developed a much more skin-forward image. Maybe Andre Rison had something to do with that. And I mean, Destiny's Child literally had a whole song called Bootylicious, so there you have that. Maya, Christina Milian, Cassie, pretty much every mid-aughts black female artist I can think of besides A. Marie all found their greatest success after turning the sexometer up at least 10 points. Even Alicia Keys, when compared to other singer-songwriter pop acts of the time like Dido and Norah Jones, for example, was always pretty heavily sexualized, albeit in an around-the-way girl art school grad kind of way. Like, aside from one really catchy 106 in Park chart mainstay, Rihanna pretty much had to name a whole album after Finding Your Inner Hoe before blowing up in the mainstream. And then her next lead single looked like this. Even Queen Bey's success is due in no small part to her bountiful booty meat. I mean, it practically co-headlined Coachella a few years ago. And now songs like WAP are topping the Billboard charts despite them not being playable in any public space without a stripper pole. Like, a part of me doesn't even believe that they've even done half the stuff they talk about on these tracks. Then again, that is pretty par of the course for rappers, so I guess that makes sense. Now, before y'all start naming Lauren and Mary J and India and Erica and Jill et al., okay, yeah, they as well as a bunch of others I don't have the time to name, their commercial success was never really pop. Mary is literally called the queen of hip-hop soul, aka struggle love music, while all the remaining artists were squarely within the neo-soul subgenre of R&B. And when that wave had reached its crest, so did their commercial appeal. So again, not pop. The only person I can think of who fits neatly into that R&B pop sphere, who at least relative to the mainstream managed to keep art the foundation of her artistry, was Ashanti. And her peak lasted all of like, what, 2 prom seasons? Again, this is admittedly a generalization, and there are more than a few examples of black women bucking the bussin' it trend and still gaining mainstream success within the pop sphere. That being said, for every her, there's at least like 2 Chloe Baileys. That was a twin joke, by the way. But okay, so let's talk about Britney for a second. I'm not going to cap like the whole jailbait element wasn't a big, if not the biggest factor in her success, but compared to most of her colored contemporaries, Britney's sexuality was always more tongue-in-cheek than please come clap these cheeks. It was pretty much understood by every non-evangelical in the world that Britney was just cosplaying a hoe. But at the end of the day, her virtue and presumably her hymen were both still intact. I mean, even though she was married to this guy for all of like 2.5 days, presumably for some guilt-free freak-a-leaking. But even then, the perception was that Britney waited, which, again, is something that good girls are generally expected to do. Britney's handlers were always careful to keep her persona as look but don't touch as possible. That's why Kevin Proto Post Malone Federline was such a big and scandalous deal at the time. Federline was made villainous due to the presumption that he had corrupted Britney, what with all his baggy jeans and backwards caps and throwback Mitchell and Ness jerseys and general affinity for urban culture. Yeah, that's totally not a coincidence at all. And I mean, admittedly, pretty much everything I said about Britney is also applicable to Beyonce, at least in the early days, but B came out the gate twerking in her first solo video. So what do we make of that? Point being, if you ask me, the sex factor was always played up with Bey from the jump. Like, I'd even argue that early on, Bey's persona was much more Christina Aguilera than Britney Spears. Speaking of, so let's go ahead and compare Britney with Christina like it's 2002 all over again. Aguilera was always presented as more white than Latina. except in times when her Latina-ness was much more exploitable according to her handlers. But then right around 2002, Christina's image shifted from generic early aughts pop princess to something a little more dirty. And then, yeah, the girl pretty much got slut-shamed until Beautiful came out. And then everybody remembered, wow, this girl can actually sing when you give her a chance. Now, think of a more explicitly Latina contemporary like Shakira, for example. Or even if you want to stretch it, J-Lo. Or even if you want to go a little further back than that, Selena. These three's appeal was always very sex-forward, even if not explicitly so. And I mean, yeah, you can call it up the culture, but they were able to gain success within the American music market because that's what Americans typically expect from Latina women. Again, there are exceptions, but my point is, historically and generally speaking, white female pop acts have always had to walk the line between wholesome and whoredom because, again, that's what's generally expected of white women in Western society. Colored and specifically black women haven't really had to be concerned with such needle threading, and more often than not, even if gradually, leaned into their sexuality in order to gain and or maintain mainstream commercial success. And none of them really received any blowback for it. Except from other black women, oddly enough. And the why to both those realities is that this is how American and, dare I say, Western society in general has always seen and treated black women as little more than sentient sex dolls.
Hey Matt, what have you been up to?
Not much, how about you?
Searching the internet for sexy lingerie.
God help us all. I made graphical reference to it earlier, but how about Miley Cyrus's public declaration of emancipation from Die Fuhrer Mickey by way of her failed attempt at self-Jezebelization? Cringe factor aside, do you think the public would have done so as hard if she weren't white? Now, I can't say definitively. All I'm doing here is conjecturalizing, which is not even a word. But that being said, I've watched a lot of award shows and even more music videos. And in the process, I've seen black girls do everything from the rodeo show to pantomiming sex acts. And the general reaction from the mainstream, or at least mainstream media, was always some version of "Yas, Queen." Now, the implications of that should have been made more obvious than Deshaun Watson's impending suspension by like the last half hour of video, but I'll just go ahead and elaborate for the purposes of said video. The hypersexualization of black people in and by mainstream media is a direct result of white supremacist ideas on blackness and therefore black sexuality. Duh. What this means is, according to Western society at least, black people, all black people, are just born to be hoes. And no, black men are not absolved of this. There's literally a whole subgenre of porn based on the Mandingo trope. And I'm not going to dive into it further in this video, but it's actually consumed by a lot more straight white men than you would believe initially. Now, with that out of the way, if your next question is, well, what's the big problem with that, Billiam? Please allow me to spoon feed you this information like the Uncle Remus that I am. The apparent inherent whoredom of black people excludes us from sexual victimization, even according to our own people. Thus, in the few times in which we do cry victimization, which according to data, we don't do that often to begin with, our cries are often brushed aside and disregarded. Because again, according to our inherent whole tendencies, in some way, shape, or form, even if we didn't realize it at the time, we were always just asking for it. Thank you, Western media. Now, I just focused on the Jezebel trope because it's the easiest and most obvious one to point out, but it's not by any means the only one. Remember a few videos ago when I talked about Sapphire? Well, if you weren't around back then, just take Jezebel and replace all the twerking and barely covered titties with a pair of Converse, some Vaseline, and a ponytail. According to Western society, white women, the non-deviants at least, are seen as fragile, delicate, innocent, naive even. and thus not only worthy, but needing of protection. Black women, on the other hand, are traditionally seen as combative, difficult, cunning even, of loose morals and even looser labias. This, of course, in my opinion, is one of the factors in why black church culture tends to be so gratuitously patriarchal and even misogynistic, even compared to mainstream evangelicalism.
1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12. I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. So, because the Bible says so. And that's it.
This, in my opinion, of course, is why Tyler Perry has managed to make a whole career out of basically embodying every single black female stereotype known to man in one 6 foot tall, 200-pound package, and still somehow managing to not make it funny. How this man hasn't been canceled yet, I do not know. This is how black manosphere grifters have managed to make a living telling 20-something-year-old jobless incels and equal parts balding and perpetually lonely 40-something-year-old players of past years that every even moderately attractive black woman that rebuffs their advances is either too fat, too manly, or a combination to just see past their blatant misogyny, their 350 credit score, or they're just straight up butt fugliness. Okay, ladies, so I'm going to go ahead and say something that I never thought that I would say on this channel, but in the context of this video, I feel like it kind of needs to be said. In a very, very general sense, black women are in fact expected to settle in ways and in areas that white women are not, in relationship and career prospects. Or else black women wouldn't be the most educated demographic in the States right now. See, my argument was never to dispute that fact. Rather, it was to push back against the idea that that expectation is held exclusively or even mostly by black men. And this, folks, is why this whole divestment trend is one of the most stupid things I've seen since Ben Simmons' Playoffs ensemble. Like, if you genuinely believe that a white man of comparable education and socioeconomic status is going to do better by you than a black man just because he's white, go ahead, roll that dice. But before you do, look at this picture, because this is you. The stone cold reality is every injustice that impacts white women does so at a disproportionately larger rate and with more disastrous effects to colors. Data says as much. But because the inherent disadvantage attached to blackness in America is a truth that many whites on both sides of the political spectrum have yet to reckon with, many just explain it away as identity politics. And y'all know how much I hate that phrase. Remember Rose? Well, when the Twitter guys decided that her revelations were a little too real for their taste, they promptly banished her to the mountains of Moria. But in a show of solidarity, just about every left-leaning checkmark on the site deactivated their accounts for at least a day. And believe me, for some of these people, that's a bigger deal than Future's kids seeing dad show up to graduation. So in the face of this insurmountable act of solidarity, Twitter had no choice but to reinstate Rose's account. Hooray, right? And you know what was one of the first things she did upon her internet emancipation? Tweeting this. Yeah, that's a very bad look, Rose. Like everything Kim has worn post Kanye bad look. And a bunch of black women, including many of the ones who stood in solidarity with the actress, said as much. And you know what happened next? Well, what always happens when black people make a point of intersectionality to the more short-sighted of our white allies, they got shut down, scolded, and scorned. You know, the Twitter leftist trifecta of deflection. Jemele Hill didn't get nearly the same kind of concentrated support when she was suspended from ESPN for just saying what we all thought. Matter of fact, know about Trump. Most of the woke women allies on the left went silent, presumably because it wasn't their fight after all. Now, I'm not necessarily defending Hill herself because she does have a habit of making some very, very, very bad takes. But that doesn't change the fact that she was a woman, a black woman whose voice was shut down for merely speaking truth to power. And few outside of her circle had anything to say other than, well, it's all Greek to me, don't you know? And how many other black women's voices were shut down within the leftist sphere for merely speaking their truth when that truth did not directly intersect with the interest of their allies? How many black women's stories go unheard until the damage is pretty much already done? How many times has a black woman been victimized not just by an individual, but by the system? And we, at least in some small part, put at least a portion of the blame on the victim for being too loud, too difficult, too ghetto, too fast, too promiscuous, or too much of the ubiquitous B word. Okay, so if God be my help, this will be the last time that I ever mention Amber Heard on this channel because frankly, it's way too messy a case for me to even be bothered with. And like I've said in the past, it still baffles me how y'all cannot see just how guttural the reactions were to this case and then juxtapose that with how barely little, if any, reaction has been being had to Brittany Griner's now extended detainment and not see what the issue is. Like, I genuinely do not get it, folks. How are we still milking this thing for clicks weeks after it's been decided? But Brittany is being unjustly imprisoned because of a misplaced edible, and we all just say, well, golly gee, that's a knock on the old noggin. Now, y'all correct me if I'm wrong, because I probably am. But part of the reason I did the first Brittany Griner video was because I didn't see any up on YouTube at the time that really delved into why the situation was so effed up. And I wanted someone to say something about it. But for like a good month or so, every time I opened my Twitter feed, all I saw were people who just a week ago didn't even know what a superego was, turned into overnight psychology experts based on this one defamation trial. Like, I halfway almost decided to not even use her example in this video because I knew how some of y'all would react. Understand something, my point isn't to demonize Amber beyond what she's already been, but it is to say, why are these two women not being protected with the same level of ferocity by the public? Why is the only reason I found out about Crystal Kaiser, a black sex trafficking victim who is currently facing a life bid for killing her abuser, was as a juxtaposition to Kyle Dickenmouth's own self-defense claim? Why did Centoya Brown serve 15 years of a 51-year sentence for, again, defending herself from rape? Why did this guy have to abuse his privilege as a white male police officer and rape multiple black women in one of Oklahoma City's poorest districts before finally being thrown under the jail like he should have always been? I mean, it's simple, isn't it? Holtzclaw targeted these women explicitly because he knew that no one would care until they had to. And that, folks, is the problem. And it's also the reason why black women are 2.5 times more likely to be abused than whites. Frankly, the only time, to me at least, that it seems our culture can acknowledge black women unequivocally as victims, no ifs, ands, buts, or asterisk in between, is when the assailant is a black man. And that's very troubling to me because it says no matter how many movements we start or protests we attend or hashtags we trend, white supremacy is still very much in this country's DNA. Black women just don't carry the same kind of value in Western society as the Beckys do. And thus, when black women demand their interests be heard, they're often belittled, berated, or just straight up ignored. Like that time Donald Dickless Jr. made the jingoist jackpot when he tweeted Maxine Waters should stop dressing like a stripper if she wanted to be taken seriously. Except that wasn't Maxine, genius. Or that time then White House Chief of Staff John Kelly said he would never apologize for a completely baseless accusation he made against Frederica Wilson. Or the time Kamala Harris was called hysterical for literally just doing her freaking job. Or the time Leslie Jones was made the subject of a maelstrom of racist and misogynistic harassment for the admitted dumpster fire of a film that was the Ghostbusters reboot? Where was her mass Twitter exodus? Or that time Aurora Perrineau, a black actress, accused Murray Miller of raping her before straight up being called the boldest face of liars by a white ally, who then admitted that she only did so to advance her own interest. Or how about the whole freaking op-ed that Lupita Nyong'o wrote about being abused by Weinstein that was largely brushed aside in favor of her white co-victim stories? You seriously mean to tell me that of all the victims to refute by name, the one that Harvey chose was the black one? Then again, and this is personal preference speaking again, she is the most out of his league, so maybe that's his defense. The point, like I said before, is that to the mainstream at least, black women's lives, interests, and voices don't really matter unless they converge with those of whites. Seriously though, someone like really needs to unpack this. Maybe even develop a whole school of thought, perhaps even a theory around this idea. I'm going to try to wrap this video up by elaborating on a point that I've made in several videos now and several times in this one. In this society, black women are reduced to little more than objects to be used by whoever, whenever, and however seen fit, including by white female allies. I've said this before and I will continue to say so until my dying breath, which based on my last physical isn't that far off. But anyway, white feminists have a nasty habit of weaponizing black voices against whoever they consider to be an oppressor, specifically straight men of any and all races. And okay, Western society is patriarchal, obviously, or else Future wouldn't have a career. And for as much as I try to be a champion for black women's interests, the fact remains that black men are the worst offenders of black women's graces. So there, y'all can have that W. But the fact is, modern mainstream feminism was not born from the collective interest of women across races, ethnicities, and socioeconomic backgrounds, but from middle and upper class liberal white women's longing for the same kind of privilege that their pecker-packing counterparts have. 3 of the 4 waves of modern feminism were formed around the interest of white women of a certain social status. This is what history tells us. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it was the right to vote. Well, mostly the right to vote. Something y'all tried to deprive black men from having ourselves, but we did wind up getting this. I guess that hatchet is buried then. The point is, y'all got what you wanted. And when you did, the movement kind of went quiet for a while, despite, Jim Crow still killing colored women by the dozens and dozens and hundreds and thousands. But hey, what's a lynch mob or two when there's votes to be cast, right? And then the 60s rolled around. These ones, not these ones. This marked modern feminism's second wave, which is really where the whole pro-choice ideology that characterizes mainstream feminism today comes from. See, for me at least, pro-choice isn't just about reproductive rights. It's the choice of domesticity, to work or to be a housewife, which historically black women have never had that choice. It's the choice of sexuality, to be a prude or to be promiscuous. Again, a choice that black women, at least according to society, never really had. And obviously the choice to carry a child to term or to abort. Again, a choice that many black women simply don't have. For many poor and therefore disproportionately black women, abortion isn't about sex with no strings attached, as many of you have already said is your primary motivator. Rather, it's acknowledgement that bringing this child to term means bringing them into a world where the odds are stacked against both I and them. It means very few people who don't look like me or come from where I do is going to empathize with, let alone care about the challenges I'll face raising a child in a society that treats us poor worse than the Pilgrims do the Powhatans. Well, the apple don't fall far from the tree now, does it? Point being, both the second and first waves of modern feminism were largely built around the idea of elevating middle to upper class white women to a status equal to white men, and less about equality for all females. And thus, ladies like Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, and Shayla Sandoval called cap and basically said everything I just did, but just way, way smarter. Matter of fact, in 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw of critical race theory fame coined the term intersectionality as a response to the largely white and middle to upper class feminist movement, bringing attention to the multiplicity of oppressions experienced by non-white and non-middle class and non-cisgender women. Intersectionality would become a primary characteristic of feminism's third wave in the 90s, but somewhere between then and now, we kind of lost it, in my very straight, very cisgendered, and very, very traditionally masculine male opinion, of course. Now, I've tried my best to write this episode in as non-combative or accusatory a tone as possible while still just trying to keep it a buck with y'all. But I mean, come on, y'all. The evidence here is worse than Drake's newest album. But the hope is those of y'all who still aren't getting it will catch up sooner rather than later. And no, that's not just a deflection from my latest failed attempt to swag surf a relatively unheralded genre of black music while it's still obscure enough for white people to be turned into a TikTok trend. I swear Drake hasn't been the same since that Pusha T beef. But then again, the dude pretty much got bullied into fatherhood. Take notes, Russell. All that being said, folks, my purpose isn't to diminish patriarchy or both it and white supremacy's cultural connections to capitalism, the real big bad in this story after all, or to deflect from many black men's habitual mistreatment of our own matriarchs, but to make a case for intersectionality. Or, put in another, and in my opinion, much better way, against the pursuit of privilege being mistaken for or even disguised as liberation for all. And I mean, all cap aside, folks, who's really going to argue against that? Looks like I'm going to hell, folks.